Been used in New Zealand as a way of opening and closing our meetings. And it's really a way to kind of bring us all and welcome us all into this shared space. So I'll read the karakia in Te Reo Māori, which is the Indigenous language of New Zealand, or Aotearoa New Zealand. And you'll see the English translation just listed below. Whakatake te hau ki te uru, whakatake te hau ki te toanga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hiaki ana te atakura, he tiho, he huka, he hauhunga, haumie, huie, tai kie. Well, welcome again, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us at different times across the globe. It's really exciting to have the opportunity to connect with people who are really passionate around community development and what that looks like in their different spaces. So as I mentioned, my name's Kim Sweeney, and I work as a senior advisor with Te Taritai Whenua, the Department of Internal Affairs in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I'm joined today by my colleague Brodie, who's a principal advisor. And Brodie and I work in the community operations branch of the department. And you'll hear us refer to our team by its Te Reo Māori name today, Hāpai Hāpori. So in our time together, Brodie and I want to share with you a bit about the story of how Hāpai Hāpori's work with communities has moved towards a high trust, community-led approach over the last 15 years or so. In the first part of our time together, Brodie will take us through the evolution of our advisory services to be grounded in community-led development principles. And then we'll look also at an exploration of how practice had to change in response to that. From there, we'll look at the second stage in this journey, and that's really around aligning our funding processes and practices with a community-led model. And we're going to look at or explore COVID-19 as a catalyst for that change or for that shift. Throughout the time that we've got, and because we do have a lovely kind of smaller number, we do want to encourage questions, and we will build in time just to pause and have an opportunity for comments and questions. We also want to really highlight the learnings that we've taken away from our journey. And then finally, at the end of our session, and this just depends how we're feeling, we might by that stage think, no, let's just stick together and work through this as a collective. Or we might choose to move into breakout groups or breakout rooms and just start to explore some of the key themes that have emerged or will emerge as we move through our time together. So before we dive into all of that, we thought it might be useful to share a little bit about our context in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and just do a little bit of scene setting for you. So while we don't have time today to explore Te Tiriti or the Treaty of Waitangi in detail, it is really important to us to acknowledge that New Zealand is a bicultural nation and that the Treaty of Waitangi is our founding document. So Te Tiriti o Waitangi was signed between Māori representatives as the Indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the British Crown in 1840. And this established British governance in New Zealand. As a government agency, Te Taritai Whenua, or the Department of Internal Affairs, has a responsibility to uphold Te Tiriti in everything that we do. So that's really critical to our work. As you'll see on the slide, Te Reo Māori, and you might have noticed a little bit already, is one of New Zealand's 3 official languages. And so we just wanted to introduce you to some of the key words that we'll use throughout our presentation today. So you will have already heard me refer to Te Taritai Whenua, which is the Te Reo Māori name for the Department of Internal Affairs, and the same with Hāpai Hāpori, the name of our branch, Community Operations. In New Zealand, Māori groupings which are connected by ancestors and geography are called iwi or tribes. And then we have sub-tribes or smaller groupings that connect back to that iwi, which we call hapu. We have whānau, which is family or extended family, tikanga, customs and practice, and then ngā matopono, which is our principles or kind of ways of working. Now to share a little bit about Te Taritai Whenua's context and the work that we do. So the department is actually New Zealand's oldest government department, and we were originally established as the Colonial Secretary's Office after the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840. And you'll see from this image here that the overarching purpose of the department is to connect people, communities, and government to build a safe, prosperous, and respected nation. And that vision is then supported by 5 key objectives around the sides. Our branch, Hāpai Hāpori, connects to the objective of iwi, hapu, and communities across New Zealand are safe, resilient, and thriving. So to do that, our role as Hāpai Hāpori is really to lead the department's direct interface with New Zealand communities. And this primarily looks like the provision of information, resources, and advice to communities, as well as the administration of grant funding. So Hāpai Hāpori does distribute grant funding to communities and to individuals, and we do that on behalf of the Crown, a number of smaller trusts, and then the New Zealand Lottery Grants Board. We are going to talk a little bit more about funding that was made available through the Lottery Grants Board later in our session. So it might just be useful to provide a quick overview of who the board are and their connection to the department or to Hāpai Hāpori before we get to that. So under our New Zealand Gambling Act, and I'm sure many countries will be the same, all profits that are received through the playing of Lotto, the game, must be used for the benefit of New Zealand communities. So it's the Lottery Grants Board's role to determine how these profits are distributed, and it's Hāpai Hāpori's role to administer that process on behalf of the board. So as you can see from this image, the Lottery Grants Board is the single greatest grant funder in New Zealand communities. And in the last financial year, $371 million was distributed back to communities. So it's a pretty significant funder. So with that scene set, hopefully that paints a little bit of a picture for you around our context. I'm going to hand back over to Brodie, and Brodie's going to take us through the evolution of our practice towards a community-led development approach. Thanks, Brodie.
Kia ora. Thanks, Kim. So good morning, good evening, wherever you are. And thanks to all of you who are at this session. So as Kim touched on, I'm just going to run through a story of the last 15 years or so, basically covering off how we as a central government department have changed and developed our approach and now continuously embed evolution of our practice into our approach. So around 15 million years ago, or I guess about 15 years ago. Te Taritae Whenua was your traditional bureaucratic dinosaur, probably not a cool T-Rex or the raptor, but more like a slow lumbering brontosaurus. So we operated with sort of old school policies and processes and approach. We had big filing cabinets with loads of paper files and manila folders all in triplicate. Staff generally sat behind their desks and assessed paper applications, printed out big assessment report books for a committee to read through, and that committee decided where the funding went. Sometimes staff got out from their desks and they went out to assess community groups or their ideas. But it was quite a formal process, so generally went to check their minutes, their policies, their procedures, their accounts, their audit reports, health and safety practices, etc., etc. So it's very transactional. And if the group managed to navigate all of this, and many didn't, then they might get some money to deliver their services to community to fix the issues that they perceived. So to quote Steve Kizian of the University of Texas, he said, "You adapt or you die. If you don't adapt, I think you're going to get swallowed up in the stuff." So I'm not saying that, that we're going to die or anything that dramatic, but what I'm getting at is that if we don't keep evolving our approach within an ever-changing community context, then we'll just be less and less effective in supporting our communities. So Te Taritae Whenua changed very little, but in 2009, they conducted a review of their funding principles. And this review showed that while the current funding approach was successful in supporting organisations, their projects, they were less successful in generating enduring or lasting positive impact within a community. So the funding review led us to understand that there was a need to change and that there were some key elements we needed to embrace. So on the slide here, you can see 10 of the elements that were identified through the review. So I'll just quickly run through each of them. So the first one around engagement. We found that a shared vision was an essential foundation for community development, and adequate time should be allowed for the vision to be developed by the community in an inclusive and deliberate way, and to be able to bring out the voices, I guess, not traditionally heard into that approach. Around relationships, that would be based on the principles of partnership, facilitating effective community development. Traditional approaches to contracting might need to be revised to support effective partnering. We also touched around the clarity of roles, and that being vital and needs to be established right at the start of the relationship. And a direct relationship between the funder and the community could assist with role clarity. Power relations, so there's the need to articulate the nature of power relations and enable communities to redress past wrongs in order to establish new structures and ways of operating. So in New Zealand, this would include addressing Indigenous rights and self-determination. Around planning, realistic goals need to be set. Outcomes and goals need to be clearly defined and have sufficient flexibility to recognise that these need to change over time. Around the leadership, so we found that successful initiatives are generally led or coordinated by skilled community development practitioners, but they also require strong local leadership and support. Community capacity, so we also learned that funders, we can play a role in building the capacity of communities to meet project requirements, but that this needs to be balanced to allow communities autonomy to lead their own development. Collaboration, so collaboration between governments and non-government agencies, this aids community development projects. and effective collaboration occurs when the key stakeholders have a shared interest in outcomes and accountabilities. Critical reflection can also help ensure that projects remain focused on their vision. In Maori community development, effective practice builds on existing whānau structures, grounded in tikanga, and encompasses a collective approach. Wide engagement of whānau together with a holistic approach to issues can contribute to the sustainability of initiatives. So we got a lot out of that review. So in this slide here, so there's the picture on the left there. So that's a statue in our capital city of Wellington. And this is a picture of the legendary explorer Kupe. And here he is with his wife, Heniti Aparangi, and his priest, Peka Horangi. So Kupe was said to have been the first human to discover New Zealand, or Aotearoa. The country's Māori name, Aotearoa, came when his wife saw a long white cloud and realised that they were nearly at land. So there might be a long bow to draw, but I mean, Te Tai Whenua also needed to explore. So we looked at the wider context and we searched for an approach that would enable us to progress what we had discovered in the 2009 review. And we came across community-led development. So this was seen to have the potential to incorporate what we had heard in our review into an effective way of supporting communities to achieve their aspirations in a sustainable and meaningful way. So I guess the underpinning philosophy of community-led development is around community empowerment, broad engagement, locally generated solutions. The approach also addresses the competitive nature of funding, because I guess traditionally there was community organisations competing against each other for a limited pot of funding, and that set up rivalries and I guess drew away from collaborative environment. So the CLD approach looks at communities as a whole, with all sectors working cooperatively for the betterment of the community. So we were fortunate in New Zealand. We had an organisation called Inspiring Communities, and we were able to kind of lean in and learn from them. And we incorporated 5 community-led development principles they had identified to form the foundation of our CLD approach. So to quickly go through these 5 principles. So the first one there, the shared local visions. So that's around building plans with those who live, care, play, and invest in a place. Tailor-making solutions that reflect local ambitions, goals, and contexts, and grow a shared sense of optimism and collective ownership of the future. Building from strengths, acknowledging that everyone has a contribution to make, valuing residents as the experts in their place, proactively involving people who are frequently ignored, recognising the strengths tangata whenua bring and build respectful relationships, and value community assets, using what you got to get what you want. Working with diverse people. This principles around fostering connections between groups who don't usually work together, supporting the aspirations of local whānau, hapu and iwi, ensuring residents are actively involved in all aspects around building relationships between neighbours, encouraging networking between community-led initiatives, locally, regionally and nationally. The fourth one there around collaborative local leadership. So this one's around seeking leadership from across the community, identifying that everyone's a potential leader and valuing different cultural approaches to leadership and supporting local people who are doing things and connect them with others to grow their effectiveness. Also investing in developing skills and capacity of local leaders, and also celebrating local leaders and community achievements along the way. And finally, learning by doing. So it's plan and work adaptively, factoring in time to just reflect on and understand on what's working and what's not, using data and insights to measure impact, and document and share progress widely and transparently, and embrace small steps that contribute towards the larger transformational changes. Okay, here's another picture. This one here is of Jean Batten. She's our most famous New Zealand pilot. So she made numerous record-breaking solo flights across the world. Her most notable one was for completing the first solo flight from England to New Zealand, which was in 1936. I think she was around 27 at the time. The Taritai Whenua have decided to run a pilot of community-led development as an approach with communities. So to support this, the department received a transfer of funding of 1.5 million per year from the Community Organisation Grant Scheme, for what we call here as COGS. COGS was a $14 million funding program that provided grants to around 5,000 community groups. So very much kind of a sort of a scattergun approach, sort of a little to a lot. So this transfer was intended to support a 4-year trial of community-led development in 4 communities. However, we found a further 400,000, which was allocated, and this enabled a 5th community to join the pilot. So you can see the community there. I think it's the 4th one down, Waitangaroa, Cannons Creek. That was one that was involved, but it subsequently dropped off the pilot due to a number of mistakes, and that included mistakes definitely from our approach with the community, and some of those errors could be attributed to a lack of training for our advisors at the early stages, and also the pressure to rapidly establish these pilots with communities that at the time did not fully understand community-led development. So when we set up the pilot, we incorporated some key elements which related to some of the findings that we had in the 2009 review. So the first one was looking at a whole of community approach. So this was around implementing broad community visioning and planning process to identify and prioritise shared community needs and aspirations. Also shifting from the 1-year grants to longer term funding, providing funding for 3 or 4 year time span, flexible funding for projects and activities. So providing communities with funding to implement the projects identified during their whole of community approach to community planning. Also around partnering, so we encourage communities, encouraging the development and fostering of relationships with existing organisations within and outside of a selected community. We also encourage communities to employ a community worker to assist with the delivery and management of community projects. And finally, the establishment of a community governance body or a facilitation team or some form of leadership group within the community, selected by the community, to oversee the development and implementation of the community plans. So alongside the delivery of this pilot was also key to that was the upskilling of Harpai Harpuri's community advisors. Because as I touched on, traditionally the advisors were fairly desk-bound. It was very transactional, very audit relationship. It was a lot of computer work, form reading. So what we did, as I mentioned, Inspiring Communities, we contracted them in to deliver a 3-year training program to grow and develop staff in the new ways of working. So this involved an organisational cultural shift away from, as I mentioned, the transactional approach to more of a relational approach. Community advisors were supported to get out from behind their desks and be present in community, to build their relationships, to build their knowledge of communities, and most importantly was to build the trust of those communities. But as with any significant organisational shift, some of the staff team took to it easily, and others felt less comfortable in the new ways of working. But we're able to kind of build off staff strengths, and those that fell easily into the community-led development space were given greater exposure to community-led development opportunities with communities. And those that struggled with the shifts, they were able to continue to support our traditional grant-making functions, which continued alongside this. So at the end of the pilot, it was deemed a success. Here are a few quotes from some of the communities around some of their thoughts around how the journey had been for them. We conducted yearly reviews, and then at the end of the pilot, we conducted the final evaluation, which, I mean, while deemed success, it also highlighted challenges and opportunities and places where we needed to continue to grow and evolve our practice as a department to better support communities. But the CLD pilot did highlight the potential that a community-led approach can have for New Zealand communities seeking to achieve positive and lasting outcomes. It provided useful learnings and examples that have assisted Te Taritai Whenua to improve its delivery of community-led development practices. So the success of this led us to building this in, or mainstreaming this approach within its own program, imaginatively called the Community-Led Development Program, or the acronym was CLDP. And the elements listed here are what we have built into this new program. So you can see a lot of these reflect some of the findings from the 2009 review, and also some of the underpinned by the community-led development principles. So community-led development as an approach still sits under all we do now as our way of working and our approach with communities, while the CLDP, the Community-Led Development Program, that became the partnering mechanism or program through which we were able to support and resource communities along their community-led development journey. So we've now partnered with probably, a little over 20 communities, and the first lot have just, coming to the end, or have just finished their first 5-year partnership. So just to summarise, so the journey's been exciting and a rocky sort of a roller coaster, and the main takeaway here is that we've evolved from that transactional to a relational approach, and at the heart of this is building understanding, connection, and most importantly of all, trust with the communities that we work alongside. So it's not quite the end of the journey. So in true CLD fashion of learning by doing, we continue to learn and evolve our approach. So yeah, it's an ever growing journey. But that's kind of a quick summary there, I guess, of 15 years. Probably a good opportunity here, I think, just to pause and maybe open it up to the floor if there's any questions or comments that anyone wanted to raise at this point of the session. Kia ora.
We're waiting, Anastasia, but can I help you? And if anybody have a question, you can call. Maybe.
Yeah, if there's any in the chat, I can't.
Roddy, I have a question for you. Can I ask you? When you talk about community development and generation, and you mean adult participant, what about the children's community? how it is represented in your country, and how is interaction between children and adults going?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So with community-led development approach, as I mentioned, we kind of look at, I guess, communities as a whole collective. So it includes youth, elderly, migrants, refugees, churches, businesses, the whole spectrum within the community. And the key to, I guess, developing up that community development plan, or the community's plan, is about being really intentional about including all the voices within that community. And if in the engagement process that there is identified some sectors whose voices aren't coming forth, then the point then is just to, deliberately target those areas of community and encourage those voices to come forth, and even sort of affirm them as leaders within, their areas or their projects that they want to see. So one of the pilots that we had there, Mount Roskill, they actually specifically went and ran workshops and sessions with primary and intermediate and college students to deliberately get those voices into a community plan, because they identified that there was a bit of a skew towards more adults putting their voices forward. So those deliberately sort of targeted those sectors. And the other way of doing it for them was to, when they ran some events around children's play in some of the local parks. And at those events, they would have kind of a little stall there where they would, they would ask the kids questions around what they liked in their community, what they'd like to see more of in the community, and just encourage that sharing of ideas.
Thank you, Brody. Aidana, Inara, maybe.
Yes, I have some questions. So thank you for your presentation. And you talked about important principles and about the importance of communication, networking in the community and between other communities, that this is such a journey, yes? Have you ever considered a virtual platform as a way to communicate between others?
Yeah, I mean, within some of our community neighborhoods, there's Facebook groups and there's WhatsApp groups, and different ways of connecting neighbors through that. And it's a useful tool for engaging, particularly as the previous question touched on around youth. Really useful tool to engage with there. But I guess when we're looking at what we're sort of working with here around the community-led development, we're really focused on sort of place being central to the approach. So it's a useful tool for engaging people within place. But I know sometimes with online communities, they are very splintered and they are sort of very spread. So that would be sort of a different approach. So as I say, it has been used as a tool within the confines of a place-based approach.
Okay, thank you.
And I have a question. Can I ask you? Thank you for your presentation. And I saw that in your presentation, in new opportunities, you write about some principle, learning by doing. And I want to ask you, maybe you have some example from your work experience where you work with this principle, learning by doing, what it means.
Yes, yeah, thank you for that. So one thing I guess I could highlight, one example would be around when we work with the pilots. We selected kind of a range of different communities, different sizes and different makeups. And one of the communities, Mount Roskill, was quite a large community. It was sort of 50 to 60,000 people there. And what we learned sort of working with that community was it was too big to build kind of effective relationships within that collective. Because as Jim Dares has touched on, having bumping points or places where communities or community members regularly see each other and connect with each other and are able to share and share their ideas and their dreams for their area, for their local area. So running through the pilots, we found that some of the other communities, which were smaller communities, one was sort of a small community up in Whirinaki, which was around 300 or 400 people. In Northeast Valley, it was sort of 4,000, 5,000, 6,000. So we found in those sort of communities, community-led development could take root a lot easier and quicker because people had better connection amongst themselves. They were better able to, see the same familiar faces at the events and build those relationships, which kind of is really key to the success of a community-led development approach. So when we did kind of come out from the pilot and move into the community-led development program, we kind of put a number on, and we sort of, generally made a guesstimate that, under 10,000 was an achievable number, but it really comes down to it being a clearly defined community. We've found sort of with some of the smaller rural communities, it's a lot easier to do community-led development because there's a sense of community there already, and it's clearly defined who's in that town. Whereas if you're in a bigger sort of metropolis with suburbs, sometimes there's a bit of a, you don't know where exactly you fit in that. So yes, that was one example, I guess, of, that we tried something, didn't really work. So then we just adjusted our approach going forward. And Kim will touch on another example when she speaks about a way that we kind of just paused what we were doing, had a look, decided things weren't working, and then sort of realigned where we were heading and just made some adjustments in going forward.
Michelle, we see you want to say, please take a word.
Thanks, Olga, and kia ora, Kim and Brodie. I'm coming to you from across the ditch in Australia. Really, obviously, I'm being an ABCD practitioner and a mate of mine, Denise, is on the call. It's great to hear, the synergies between community-led development and asset-based community development. But I want to go back to the comment, Brodie, we said, talk about the dinosaurs and thinking about how did you bring the dinosaurs within government on the journey to embracing a different way of working, from a more traditional top-down approach of community development to that more community-centered and picking up those 5 principles. I can imagine may not have been as easy as it sounded in your presentation.
Oh, sure, yeah, no, that's a great point. We were fortunate at the time that we had a minister who was really open to exploring community-led development, and so she instigated the funding review in 2009, and then was then present while we explored kind of different different options. So I guess having sort of someone at the top who was really open and curious, and inquiring around what would be a good approach and what could be really effective. And also, I mean, we're only a small, Hapai Harpur is just a small team within central government. We're around about 100 odd advisors scattered across the country. So moving a smaller grouping within central government, I think, was also an easier thing to do. But a couple of the challenges, I guess, was just around, risk. Government's very adverse to risk, and that can be around, not only financial risk about investing in something that doesn't potentially work, but also around reputational risk. If they're seen as being, too open to certain ways, or just not having, say the press, challenging them around certain practices or things that we've done that haven't worked. So it was just around being a bit braver, I guess, as a small branch within the government, to be open to, things potentially not working. But yeah, so it hasn't, it has, as I said, it did have its ups and downs. And I guess within the branch, there are also kind of people who were, have been working for our branch for a long time, and they were employed as sort of grant workers. So that was around that transactional approach. So kind of shifting some of that culture. There was sort of, it came at different times. People would shift at different times. So there was some resistance and some friction around that as well. And then, as I touched on the training, I guess, but also as advisors, we would kind of have to walk a bit of a tightrope at times. We were kind of in between, because we'd have central government giving us kind of policies, and quite sort of restraining policies, and then we'd be working with communities and trying to encourage community-led development, which can be as open as anything. So often there was a little bit of an imbalance there, but that was kind of early on in the pilot. And as we got towards where we are now, we're in a better space where we've kind of had the experience now, and we're open to being more trusting and giving more power over to community to be able to decide. And I guess with changing personnel, we've kind of become more open to, being more, less risk adverse, I guess. And we can see the benefits and success, and by capturing the stories of some of the great transformational change that is occurring within community because of this approach, that then starts to continue to shift the approach.
Thank you, Brodie. And I've got so many more questions, but I'll let Jaya go next.
Cool.
We have another question, please.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Brodie and Kimberly. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, perfect.
Yes, okay. I'm also from Melbourne, Australia. I've got two questions. I'm really interested in this topic, and just wondering whether you've had any discussion or measurements around sustainability. Did you find that community-led initiatives have some tendency towards more sustainable development, and that the community is able to embrace these initiatives and keep going because they've had the ability to lead the progress? And my other question is around the actual funding, because it's coming from gambling funds. Have you had any kickback from any anti-gambling groups to your grants programs?
Yeah, so I'll touch on the funding one first, because the community-led development program is actually funded through our Crown funding scheme, so that comes from taxpayers' contributions. So in that aspect, we don't have any of that kickback. But as within our lottery funding, definitely, yeah, we do have organisations, particularly churches, that don't apply for that funding because of that that stigma around gambling and harm, and also I guess the fact that a lot of those tickets do come from the poorer communities. So yeah, but within the community-led development program, it's a Crown-funded program. And around the sustainability, that was primarily one of the drivers, I guess, for the shift, because when they done the review, they saw that, you know, organisations delivering service to the community, you know, might have good outcomes in terms of a project being delivered for a year or two, but you know, sometimes the organisation will then change its priorities, and then those services will vanish for community, and that would leave a hole. But when community are deciding, you know, what their aspirations or their strengths are, and they're building and growing those, then as you touched on, you know, they do have the buy-in, and they do have the passion then more so to keep things going. Because sometimes, I guess, you know, like local authorities, sometimes, you know, they'll be delivering services out to communities, or even if they're running like a community centre, if the council's running it, it can get, you know, tagged or not so well looked after. But if that asset is a community-run asset, then you'll often find that the community will take a lot more pride in that asset, and they'll take care of it, and they kind of know who's in their neighbourhood and who might be up to no good, and they, you know, they can speak to their whānau or their family or their friends to kind of, you know, just keep them in line. So there's ways that community kind of, yeah, sort of self-regulate, I guess, and look after their own things. And if it's, you know, if the community's idea and there's a broad support for that idea, then yeah, sure, it's going to be sustained and well supported. But that's not to say that, you know, after a few years, the community might say, okay, that project's kind of run its, or that initiative or that idea's run its course, and we want to do something else. And that can happen as well as people kind of transition in and out of communities.
Yeah.
I think, sorry, just to jump in, because I think that's such a good question, and I think it's sort of jumped out at me because we have recently had an evaluation of the community-led development program itself done. And I put the link in the chat to that if anyone's particularly interested. There's a summary, which is much nicer than the 70-page document, so maybe go into that one. But one of the things that we're learning, I suppose, as we've now had, I think it's 5 years of the program itself being up and running, is around that sustainability element, and how do we kind of better support our community partners from the outset of their journey to start to think about what do sustainable structures look like come the end of that 5-year journey. And so what we're really focusing on now is what does that look like? How can we support our community partners to kind of determine what other partners they might want to draw in, so that partnership's not just between the department and the community, but it might be much more collaborative in the sense that we're building that support around the community to help them continue to move forward post the partnership. And I think, as Brodie mentioned earlier, we know like the importance of that community connector or developer role. We've seen that that's been the really key element in the success of our communities being able to move forward with their aspirations. So it's sort of looking at, I guess, those 2 tiers of sustainability, one around the community-led initiatives themselves, so community maintaining their passion to drive towards the aspirations, but then the structures and support mechanisms that help to kind of provide that oversight of moving those aspirations forward. And I think that that is definitely something that we're still kind of grappling with and continuing as part of our learning journey as well. So such a good question, and if anyone's got any great ideas, please do share.
I didn't get that link, so if you wouldn't mind putting that link again, that'd be great. Thank you.
Inara, please.
Yes, I have one more question. So it's both for Brodie and Kim. If we talk about you, a little separately from community, what is your personal motivation, and have you ever faced the problem of professional burnout, if I correctly asked. Sorry for my English.
No, that's fine. Yes, yeah. You mean in terms of sort of work burnout or work within community?
Sorry?
How do you mean by burnout? Is that a sort of within our work roles?
Your personal.
Personal role, yes, yeah. Well, I guess, yeah. Well, certainly the last couple of years has been very difficult with, you know, with the pandemic, and yeah, trying to still, I guess, sort of, you know, operate how it's really limited our ways of working. You know, we've sort of done this transformational, this evolution, and then, you know, we can't go out to community anymore, and it put a lot of stresses, yeah, on our ways of working, and also sort of, I guess, at home during, you know, we're, you know, as we all did, I'm sure, you know, many lockdowns and, you know, many, you know, loss of family members and disconnection, you know, children at home and, you know, being disconnected from school and friends. So that's probably been the most challenging period in terms of sort of really draining, and hard to, yeah, be able to sort of, you know, it's been a challenge to be able to stay positive and engaged and still sort of be effective both in a work and a home life. But yeah, as I say, I think that's been reflected by many people right across the globe.
Thank you, Inara. And I have one question for you, Brody, and for you, Kimberly. We talk about this connectedness between governments and communities. But in your practice, which problems do you attribute in the human factor and which to the system? And how do you separate them in your work? Some practice examples, please.
Yeah, I guess with the, you know, when you're working in community or within a system, it is kind of, you know, if you break it down, it is just a collection of, you know, of individuals, of human beings that form to make a community. So it makes it a sort of a very complex system, and ever changing, ever evolving. And every community, therefore, you know, by definition, is going to be unique because it's made up of, you know, a different collective of individuals. So for me personally, I find, you know, to help the practice, it's very important to spend a lot of time within that community, and sometimes just, you know, not in a work atmosphere or sort of a work setting, but just being present there, going along to events and activities and exploring the community. I know a few communities I've been in, and sometimes it's just sort of, yeah, just walking around the community, getting a feel for the community, visiting certain places, and just getting just picking up the energy and who's in that community, and then starting to sort of build those relationships within that community, and those there sort of help to, you know, when you then start kind of working alongside that community, I would then already have kind of an insight, I guess, into what some of the aspirations and some of the dreams and strengths, I guess, are in that community. And that, knowing, having that knowledge and that relationship, and hopefully having built a little bit of trust within that community, then help to facilitate, you know, that larger kind of, you know, shift. Because if you've got a better understanding of all the elements, or as many elements as you can, then when it comes to understanding more of a transformation or a system shift, you then have the tools and the relationships to be able to draw on or understand how that might best work, or how best to work within that community to enable that to happen. And sometimes it's just, you know, not doing a lot, but, just being aware of the environment and hopefully encouraging a real learning and empowered sort of environment where people feel that they can step up, or they can ask questions, or they can sort of come up with an idea or lead on something here or there, or they might lead for a bit and then step down, someone else comes up, and all of those different elements will then work towards that larger system shift.
I think just to add to that, because I think that's such a good question, and especially being in a government department, there's certain communities, many communities who have a discomfort in working with government. And so I think, as Brodie said, there's for us to be able to work effectively with communities in a trusted kind of partnering way, we first have to kind of really acknowledge that sometimes there can be that power imbalance, and then take the time to work through that and get to a place where community start to see us as advisors as part of them and kind of working alongside them. So it's the real time commitment to kind of work through that face of government, I think, is really important. Yeah.
Thank you. Somebody else have a question? Okay. Can I ask you again? On statistic, every community comes to a crisis maximum in 5 years. In your practice, are there any universal step for the community during the crisis, or it's a unique approach of each individual case in your practice?
So what was the first part of that?
How community pass the crisis and have any universal steps? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, with some of the communities we've been working with, sometimes crisis is what brings those communities together. But I think, that might even be a good segue into your section, Kim, where we talk about sort of our approach to how community-led development as an approach has kind of enabled us to support communities within the COVID-19 environment, which has been a crisis across the communities.
Yeah, that's a good point, Brodie, and maybe if there's more that is unanswered at that point, we can spend some more time with some questions. But that sounds good, because I'm feeling engrossed in this conversation. I'm thinking, oh, we're not going to even get through the second half at this rate. So we will carry on, and then we'll come back to some more questions. But yeah, I mean, as Brodie's mentioned already, and as we've just been discussing, adopting a CLD or community-led development practice approach really encourages us to be really flexible, relational, and responsive in the ways that we're working with community. And Brodie sort of talked a little bit about how we are aiming to do that. And to date, the community-led development program has acted as our flagship in terms of our funding approach to community-led development. So we've got our practice work, which is our way of working that we're grounding in CLD. And then we're looking at how can we move more of our funding approaches to a community-led development model too. So just, I guess, to provide a little bit of context around that, and linking back to COVID, as we all know, in 2020, the world changed for us all with the emergence of COVID-19. And the community need that resulted out of the pandemic really acted as a catalyst. It's for our shift towards a more flexible and high trust funding model, which extends beyond the community-led development program itself. So I wanted to just share with you a little bit about the funding approach that we took to supporting communities in their response to COVID-19, and how that approach was grounded in the community-led development principles, and just take you through the establishment and delivery of that fund, as well as some of our learnings and what we're hoping to take forward as our next steps. But before we do that, I thought it might be useful to provide a little bit of context around New Zealand's experience of COVID-19. In 2020, March 2020, New Zealand went into lockdown, and we were all asked to stay at home and be kind to one another. As with many countries in the world, all non-essential services were closed, and a state of national emergency was declared. So travel outside of our homes was allowed only for access to essential services, and of course for exercise. Heard someone's dog barking in the background before and thought, yes, that's exactly right, they need to get out. And New Zealand moved between different levels of restrictions between March 2020 and June 2020, when all the restrictions were lifted across the country and we were free to go back to life as normal. Unfortunately, in August 2021, we had a second wave of the virus and lockdown was reinstated. This kind of marked for New Zealand a transition to a regional restriction approach. And for parts of New Zealand, those lockdowns lasted until November 2021. So since the outbreak, the initial outbreak, New Zealand's had approximately 1.7 million cases of the virus and sadly nearly 2,000 deaths. Alongside the health statistics, the impact of the virus has been really vast and really varied on our communities. And we've seen an increasing need from communities across Aotearoa as the impact on employment, the economy, families, education, and overall community wellbeing has been felt. On the positive side, what we have also seen is a really huge mobilisation of local neighbourhoods and community groups and organisations taking the lead and supporting one another. And I know that's similar to across the globe. As I mentioned at the outset today, supporting the resiliency of communities is part of Te Taritau Whenua's mission. And in July 2020, the Lottery Grants Board agreed to allocate $40 million towards a COVID-19 relief fund, which was to be developed and delivered by Harpur. Again, imaginatively, we called this fund the Lottery COVID-19 Community Wellbeing Fund. And the purpose of the fund was really to provide one-off grants to support hapu, iwi, and community in their response to the ongoing impact of the virus. The hope was that this funding would support communities with social and community initiatives that strengthened their resiliency. And the shaping of the fund, the CRD principles, so the community-led development principles, the 5 principles we talked about earlier, were identified as underpinning the direction and the shape of the fund. And in part, this was a recognition that no two communities were experiencing the impact of the virus in the same way. And by grounding the fund in community-led development principles, the hope was that we could support communities to determine and lead their own responses. So what did this actually look like in action? For our applicants, this meant a simplified application process, which required really limited supporting documentation. In fact, no supporting documentation was required for requests of less than $50,000. And this marked a transition for us. And typically for a funding request, we require a budget and financial accounts for applications of any size, whether it be $1,000 to $10,000 or $100,000. But by stripping back the supporting documents required, Hāpai Hāpori had to really embrace or truly embrace that concept of high trust and become more comfortable, as Brody mentioned before, with a higher level of risk in the funding space also. To allow for communities to identify their own need and then determine their own method of response, the fund also had a really wide funding priorities. So the priorities were around supporting Harpur, iwi and community organisations that delivered social and community initiatives but had been impacted by the virus. And that could be either through the loss of funding sources or through extra or changed demand on their services. Might also be requests for innovative and transformative community or social initiatives, again, responding to the impact of COVID-19. And then, as we talked about before, really trying to encourage that collaboration. So collaborative community or social initiatives that strengthened and increased the resiliency of communities. To allow for a relational approach, which we know kind of supports that reduction of a power imbalance, we established rather a centralised assessment system, and that was used to process all incoming applications. And what this meant was that our community advisors were freed up to be able to engage with communities and could provide support around the shaping of their applications and begin to really understand the local community needs. In addition, we had a localised decision-making structure, which was different for us in terms of how we often operate. And that was developed to allow for a quick turnaround in funding requests to try and be really responsive to that need. And it also allowed us to honour the local knowledge that our regional teams had gained through that relational approach. And finally, at the other end of the funding process, a simple results reporting structure kind of continued to reflect a high trust model. So I've just thrown a whole lot of information at you. So I thought to bring this to life a bit, I'd share an example of a project that was supported by the fund. And this was the development of an initiative to support Māori families to learn how to grow and harvest food, or kai in Māori. And the project itself was driven by local leaders who had identified that food security was a significant concern for their Māori community as a result of COVID-19. And over the period of January to June 2020, over 14,000 food parcels had been delivered to Māori families. And for these local Māori leaders, they didn't see this as a sustainable way of servicing that need. So instead, they applied for funding to be able to teach Māori families how to grow and harvest their own kai. And their vision was that this would be giving families the skills to determine their own food security in a way that was sustainable and ongoing and didn't rely on someone else. So that real self-determination and empowerment. And the project was also an opportunity to start to re-establish the traditional cultural relationships that Māori in this community had with the land. And the intent was that this would have a much wider impact on overall health and well-being. So while we had some really, really awesome initiatives, and that was just one of them that was supported by the fund, we also had lots and lots of learnings. And this is where I can talk a little bit more about our Learn by Doing principle coming to life as well. So I just wanted to share those learnings, but also to highlight the structures that allowed us to capture those learnings, because I think that's important to think about too. So once the fund was launched in October 2020, the working group that had led the development of the fund was replaced by a governance group. And the governance group's role was to oversee the smooth delivery of the fund, including was the fund meeting its purpose and its intent. The group met monthly, and and they reviewed data around how the funding was being applied. I think really wanted to note this sort of behind the scenes process, because it's not something that our customers or our applicants would have seen. But what it did, whilst requiring an ongoing commitment, it also enabled that learn by doing CRD principle to come to life. And it soon became evident that we did need to take a step back and make some adjustments to the fund. So the governance group quite quickly observed that the demand for the fund was much higher than had been anticipated, and in large, the demand wasn't aligning with the intent of the fund. What we were seeing was an overrepresentation of applications from larger organisations which had fundraising infrastructure to seek funds, and primarily those requests were to cover a loss of income or an increase in services, so really operational and business as usual in nature. On the other hand, requests from our priority communities who were leading resiliency or strengthening community efforts at a grassroots level were significantly underrepresented in the requests that we were seeing come through. So having kind of identified those unexpected trends, the governance group then had to make a decision about what to do with that information. And their decision was to pause the grant making and take the time to adjust the funding priorities. So that's kind of a learn by doing example in action. So in March, the following year, 2021, the fund was launched again in the tranche 2. And this time the focus was on ensuring that there was greater access by communities rather than organisations. So really leaning into that community-led space. And funding was being directed towards transformative and innovative projects as opposed to the status quo. And the good news, so we did see, as a result of these changes, a significant increase in the number of requests from our priority communities. To take our learning even further, Harpur commissioned an external evaluation of the fund at the end of 2021. And this really allowed us to dive a little bit deeper into understanding the community impact of having a higher trust, community-led development focused approach. And from our survey and interview feedback with recipients, the evaluation found that the fund enabled a wide range of community-led responses, including community programs developed and grown by volunteers, so that local leadership element coming through, resilience, building opportunities, and supporting access to services. The evaluation also identified that the application process was straightforward, relatively straightforward, and easy to access by most organisations. But one of the key kind of evaluation findings that I wanted to highlight, and it goes back to our conversation before actually, is the importance of our well-connected community advisors with close networks in their communities and positive and constructive relationships. And this was actually identified by the evaluation team as one of the key enablers of the success of the fund. What we do know though, and we will all know this, is that trusted relationships take time to build. And in most instances, these relationships that the evaluation is referring back to existed well prior to the establishment of the COVID-19 Community Wellbeing Fund. So what that really highlights to us is there's this interconnectivity between a CLD or a community-led practice approach and then a community-led development funding approach. Both of them weave together to support one another to succeed. So with all of that learning under our belt, so what is next for us? Really, the COVID-19 fund highlighted that there's a real impact from a high trust, flexible, model in terms of enabling communities. And so we are taking those learnings forward in our development of new funds. We have 2 funds that we're looking at the moment, one which has been launched as a trial, the Community-Led Development Small Initiatives Trial, and our Harpur-led development pilot, which is really in its infancy at the moment. But just to introduce you to those briefly, and to kind of highlight what we're bringing through as our learnings. The Small Initiatives Trial, which we launched in October last year, really has the purpose of being able to support rapid, small, grassroots, community-led initiatives. And the trial doesn't have a specific outcome or changes determined in terms of what we expect to see as a result of the funding, but the aim is to encourage and enable community-led initiatives. So it takes lots of different shapes and forms in terms of what we're funding. In the shaping of the trial, we have been able to build off of our learnings from the COVID-19 Wellbeing Fund. And with that in mind, that the intent is really to continue to improve equity of access to funding. So to make sure that we're really reaching out within our community, and that there's a broad range of applicants coming forward to us. That we're promoting that relational approach again, and really trying to build those trusted partnerships between us and communities. And that we're doing this in a quite a high speed way so that we can support the momentum within community and the funding mechanisms kind of not slowing down what's happening in communities. We're also hoping to encourage self-realisation and self-determination, so providing that little bit of resource to support communities in terms of leading their own change. And wanting to promote and really encourage small-scale community-led initiatives, knowing that sometimes it can be the smallest things that lead on to really great change. To date, we've supported some awesome community initiatives, lots of different sizes and shapes, and few of those, I just wanted to share a couple of the examples with you, one being funding towards the purchase of a community barbecue. Barbecues are big in New Zealand and Australia, and this funding went to a small community who have had experienced at the local council reducing the funding of their community facilities. And what that meant was that a number of the places where people would regularly come together were either open for shorter hours or had been forced to close. And so the community identified that actually they wanted to be able to come together and spend time as a community to connect. And so with the support of the CLD initiative, they've been able to purchase their barbecue, and they've since held a number of small community events to be able to connect and come together. Another really nice example is funding towards a community-led mural project. And the purpose of the mural really was to improve community pride through beautification, but there was also the opportunity to bring people together to determine what was the mural going to look like, what was the design of the mural, and then to do the actual painting of the mural itself. So while the outcome or the output was a mural, the outcome was much wider in terms of that community connection that could be built. And then finally, the establishment of a community food cupboard and the planting of a fruit orchard. And this is a really cool one because it really leans into that principle around working from a place of strength. And in this instance, the community members with the gardening skills are leading the initiative, and then they are training those who are new to gardening with how to establish a garden at home. So there's some really cool projects coming up in that space too. Finally, I just wanted to quickly touch on the Harpur-led development pilot. And as I mentioned, this is really in its infancy in terms of development. But I just wanted to acknowledge this pilot because it's another kind of learning in terms of acknowledging that the current community-led development program doesn't necessarily meet the needs of Harpur and iwi. And so the intention of this pilot is to co-design a program with Harpur that can be shaped to result in a program that supports Māori to lead their own development. So that's quite an exciting initiative for us that's just starting to bubble away at the moment. So just a couple of key messages, I think, or a few takeaways, because we've shared a lot with you today in a relatively short period of time. And I just wanted to sort of highlight some takeaway messages before we finish up with some more questions. And what we've taken away anyway is that for any organisation wanting to move towards community-led development practice, relationships within the community are really central, particularly when we're talking about government organisations where there is that existence of a power imbalance. In a CL, a community-led development approach, particularly in the funding space, requires a high level of trust and a comfort with risk. We also have learnt that building in opportunities to reflect and learn enables that growth and that ongoing journey towards the end goal. And then finally, we know that there's still more work to be done, and moving towards a true community-led development approach is a journey. So it's an ongoing journey for us. So those are the wee bits that I just wanted to kind of leave you with. And happy to open up again for any more questions.
Thank you, Kimberly. Anastasia, press you the word.
Thank you very much. Such great experience. Thank you very much for your contribution and for your input. We just have 7 minutes. Oh, just 6 minutes before we have to end. So maybe some questions or reflections of this great presentations. So many good messages in the chat, especially the invitation to Darwin, I think.
Mm-hmm. Jaya, did you have a question there?
Yeah, just wondering, as we're coming out of COVID, what are your thoughts about that small grant process? Will you keep it going?
Well, that is a really good question, and I'm looking at my colleague Martin, who's leading that work. I think at the moment it is in a trial stage, and we have seen that there have been less applications at this stage than perhaps what we expected that there would be, largely as a result of COVID. So as I understand it, the trial has been extended slightly, or will be extended slightly, to be able to allow for more applications. And then it will be really about kind of diving in to see, is this meeting a need within the community? And are there opportunities to build this into any of our other funding sources? So I think it'll just require a bit of a review. What we do know, though, is that there are some really interesting projects coming through, and as Brodie said, there seems to be a real keenness within communities to start to reconnect with one another. So I think all of those things will be taken into consideration in terms of determining what's the next step. And part of it for us is we kind of talk about this spectrum of opportunities to connect in to community-led development funding. And we've got our community-led development program right down this end, where it's quite a significant contribution from communities or commitment from communities in terms of that 5 years. And then we've got the small initiatives right down here, which might just be a small, you know, the purchase of a barbecue. So for us, it's kind of about looking across our funding sources and thinking, how can we support communities that are at different stages of their community-led development journey to continue to move forward towards their aspirations, whether that just be a one-off opportunity or whether it be something more longer term. So I think there's some thinking for us to do in terms of that wider spectrum of funding opportunities.
Thank you. I've got a follow-up question.
Go for it.
Any of the learnings from the COVID experience, do you think that can be embedded a bit more into the run-of-the-mill program? So any changes that you've learned through COVID, can that be embedded now a lot more so that that's not lost? Those good learnings are not lost?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's definitely something we're working through at the moment. Particularly one of the things for us in terms of some of our structures is we've got different stakeholders who interact with the process, whether it be committees, whether it be panel members. And so it's kind of making sure that we're taking those different players along that journey with us. So I think there's certainly opportunities that we are doing some work around looking at simplifying our application forms and reviewing kind of what supporting documents are we requiring. So yeah, there definitely will be work happening in that space across, like you say, across our kind of business as usual funding sources as well, because there is lots of learning to take forward. Yeah.
Right, thank you.
Just a short, brief remark. We are based in such different countries, but we face such similar challenges. And it's so important that we have this opportunity to learn from each other, because you are based in New Zealand, we are based in Georgia, but so many similar challenges. Thank you very much for sharing with us your expertise and experience.
Thank you. Thank you for having us, and thanks for contributing, everyone.
Michelle, maybe a few words from you in terms of invitation to Darwin. We have just 1 minute before we will end this session.
Thank you, Anastasia. Absolutely, an invitation for the whole world to come and join us in Darwin next year for the 2023 World Community Development Conference from the Edge. And it's great to see Denise here with us tonight, who's my IACD Oceania trustee, and we're certainly looking forward to seeing people face to face. It's great that we have this opportunity to do it virtually, but nothing replaces that actually seeing people face to face, being able to give each other a hug and just connect. So please come to Darwin, and we promise we'll give you great top-end hospitality and beautiful warm weather. So please join us. Submissions are open if you're wanting to present, and also registrations are open if you're wanting to join us. Early bird registration finishes on the 31st of December, so we encourage you to get in early.
Great, thank you. We will have today. We will have our plenary session. I think it will be 4 a.m. for Australia, and so it will be around 6 a.m. for New Zealand. Am I right? We will show the video about Darwin, we'll share all these links, and we will tell to everybody. It's a pity, but we don't have now with us our delegates from Australia and New Zealand because it's night for them or early morning. So if you want to see them, please, next year, go to Darwin. And then you will see our delegates from Australia and New Zealand. You have only one chance, go to Darwin. So thank you very, very much to everybody for this session. We hope to meet you again on our next events. Thank you and see you soon. Bye.
Thanks, Kim and Brody, and great backup work there, Martin. We'll
Thanks,
catch you
everyone.
we'll catch you in Darwin next year.
Great presentation,
See you there.
everyone. Thank you.
Cheers,
Thanks,
guys.
Denise.
Thank you.